welcome. Welcome to the last virtual hike here on the blue-green trail that's running along the Assabet River from Maynard into Acton. We might be into Acton now. I'm not really sure exactly where we are. We're going to start here in just a couple minutes. We'll let a couple people, if they are logging in now, if they're having so many issues, we'll just wait a couple minutes for everyone, and then we'll commence. I'm not expecting to introduce too many more trees. We'll talk about a little bit more. We've seen a lot of trees already, and there's not much in the rest of the tour, unless the rest of this trip. What we're going to do is talk more about land use history and ecology and a few other things. And we got Alon here to help out. Brent Mathison's on.
Hi.
Brent Mathison's on running the camera again today.
Hello.
We're more than 6 feet apart. I'm going to put my mask up when I'm not looking into the camera and talking. I think in case people need some hard of hearing, I want to do some lip reading. I'll pull my mask down during that time. But we'll just wait another minute or two to get going. You can hear the red-winged blackbirds.
Official nickname, Mooker G Bird.
Well, that's our nickname. They just learned of this trail and they're walking on it for the first time.
Cool.
Got a sidekick here. Hold on. No. This is not fun. No. So we're starting in the wetland where we left off last time, and you can see that the skunk cabbage are really taking form, dominating the landscape in places. And I'm going to start my clock now. This will be about a 30-minute hike, a little bit less, not too far. My name is Neil Pederson. I'm a research ecologist, research forest ecologist at the Harvard Forest. Today I'm representing the Maynard Tree Committee, or not the Tree Committee, the Maynard Tree Corps, which is a group that supports the Maynard Tree Committee. We're a new group here in town with the main goal is to grow and preserve the forest canopy of Maynard's forests. And we have our first event coming up sometime in mid-May. Look for an announcement about that. We'll be planting a tree at Fowler. We have a Facebook page, blog, Instagram, and a YouTube channel where this video will eventually go. Our prior 4 episodes of this hike are there already. And the purpose of this hike, initially we were going to have it on March 20th for the spring equinox. We were going to do a public walk and to learn how to do trees, learn how to identify trees without leaves so we can learn them in the winter conditions. And then COVID came and we canceled it, and then we uncanceled it, and we've decided to do these series of hikes, these 30-minute clips of virtual hikes. And for my own sake, personally, I wanted to do this stretch as a Tree ID Blitz because I had never tallied how many trees are here along this stretch of trail, but I knew that there was a good number, and so that's why we're also doing that as well. So I'm going to be giving you ways to identify tree species based upon just 1 or 2 external traits or characteristics, I'm not a true botanist. I use more of a gestalt method where I look at the whole of the tree and think about where I am and where the tree is growing and other things, and narrow down to a species. And so I wanted to start a little bit further back than where we initially started, because what we have here is a willow, and you can see right here the flower is starting to take form. I don't think it's pussy willow tree. There are many different kinds of willows. There's a lot of subspecies, a lot of different species. So much so that when I learned trees as an undergraduate, our professor said, "Don't worry about it. There's willows, and there are a lot of willows." So this is a willow. I've not worked on identifying it down to the actual species. There's another large one behind Brent, a slightly larger trunk right there. No, hold on. And so there are many different kinds of willows. I wouldn't be surprised if this is native, but I can't say that for sure. And I'd also say this might be a legacy of what we're going to see at the end of this trip. At the end of this portion of the hike, we're going to go into where there was a gunpowder mill, and willow was important for the functioning of the gunpowder mill. So that's our 25th species so far, 25th tree species, willow. And now we're going to just walk a ways down the trail. A lot of this will be review. This tree right here, you'll see the branching. This is a great tree to, great example of this species. This is Nyssa sylvatica, or black gum, black tupelo. Pepper ridge is another name. And its branching is at roughly 90-degree angles out from the stem. And that is really one of the best traits for this species until it gets about 300 years old, 250 years old and older. The bark starts changing in ways where you can really identify and separate it out from other species. This is a young one, and this is growing fairly quickly, so there's nothing really characteristic about this tree except for the 90-degree branching right here. This is another review. This is yellow birch. You can see the golden color, the curliness of the bark right there. Yellow birch, and it's an unusual species here. You can find it all the way down to Alabama, but it's growing, a little out of place. It's more of a northern species, and so here, down close to the river at slightly lower elevation, we're in a cold pocket, or a drainage, and so this northern species, with a lot of water here draining off the slope behind Brent, going down to the river, helps this northern species do well in a slightly warmer, slightly more southern location for this species. So yellow birch, growing here on a northeast facing slope at near elevation of the river, which we'll see in just a minute. Now the definition of what's a tree and what's a shrub gets a little murky, and it depends on how you want to lump things. I'm going to call this a small tree. It's a large shrub. It's kind of a tree, small, very small tree. This is Clethra alnifolia. It's also called summer sweet in this area. There's another name called pepperbush, and this is the best trait for me to identify this. It looks like peppercorns coming off this. We'll see some more individuals up ahead where I can show you what the bark, more characteristic bark looks like. It's just about to break bud. Its leaves are small, not too, I don't know what their leaves are. I haven't memorized them enough so much. But it's these fruiting structures, the pepperbush, it helps you identify it. There's a species down in this down in the Cumberland Plateau area that I've seen mountain pepper bush, where it gets really mature. It gets this beautiful cinnamon red bark. It would be a lovely tree to plant in our yards if it was commercially available.
What's this?
That's Alon's asking what this is. That's red maple. Let's go. Oh, that's our 26 species, by the way, that pepper bush. And we've already seen this. This is alder. I don't know which species it is, but Brent, if you can get a good close-up of those fruit structures. That's how I identify alder. It's not a large tree. It does well down in wetlands like this. I don't know. I have not studied them so much. Can't tell you too much more than that, but that fruiting structure is how I'm able to identify it. And here's a review tree. This is sweet birch if you're from down south, black birch if you're from up north, cherry birch, which is another species for it, and the name, I think cherry birch comes from the lenticels and these that turn into horizontal lines in the bark, which kind of remind you of a cherry. It's got very dark bark. I was splitting some firewood the last week, and I popped open the one cherry birch. I don't want to call it cherry birch. The black birch log that I had dropped off at my house, and the heartwood was a beautiful red color, almost like a cherry as well. So I can see where that name comes from. But that's black birch. It's more of a southern species than a northern species, and it grows in a variety of habitats. You can tap it for its sap in the spring and turn it into a type of syrup, sort of like maple syrup, but not as good as maple syrup. Here we have high bush blueberry. We've seen this already. We've talked about it a little bit, but here are its flowers coming out. It grows very well in wetlands. It seems to, compete well, survive in wetlands, and so this wet area down above just above the river is really good habitat for our high bush blueberry. That's northern red oak. Come on, love. This is another review species. This is eastern white pine, Pinus strobus. Another name for it is pumpkin pine. That's an old common name for it. And that name comes from it having the heartwood of the center part of the tree where the wood is most inert or less alive can often be orange, so that's the name pumpkin pine. There's a disease, a few diseases hitting these species, and they're not doing so well, this species. But this one seems to be okay. It's got a fairly dense crown, but we're in a nice grove right here. This is a large individual, but these are one of the fastest growing trees in this part of the world. And I wouldn't be surprised if this tree was only 90 years old. They can grow extremely fast. And this is another review species here, and I wanted to stop at this one for two reasons. This is an ash. I can't tell exactly if it's white ash or green ash. I'd like to call it a white ash. It's very hard to separate those two species unless you have the seeds, and when you have the seeds then it's harder. It's easier to tell them apart, but it's still not easy. This bark right here is really characteristic of white ash bark. The diamond patterns, the interlacing of the ridges and furrows. And then when I step away, Brent can get a better picture of that bark. And then he can pan up. And eventually you'll see that this one is alive. It does have some fine twigs on the end of its branches, and it's not unusual that there are live white ash trees, but ashes are in decline. There's a emerald ash borer that's coming through this region, and it's going to wipe it out, unfortunately. But there's also been diseases like white ash decline and ash yellows, and a lot of complex diseases that have been hitting the ash over the last 20 years, almost 30 years now. And so this is a live tree. We don't see many live ash as much anymore. They're an important part of the landscape, baseball bats, all that. Stop by this tree for just 1 second. This is a northern red oak, Quercus rubra. That's an extremely large, not extremely large, they're much bigger ones. But that's a large one for this landscape. As we talked about last time, this landscape, this forest, is only 90 to 120 years old, and probably a little less that in places. And this is also one of the fastest growing trees in our region, and it's just, I think of it almost like an animal or a beast. It just grows and grows and grows, and not much interrupts its growth except for gypsy moth defoliation, and then a severe 2-year drought can kill these trees as well. That's what some of our research has seen, but otherwise it just grows. It parties like it's 1999 until something tells it to stop growing. This herbaceous species with the what looks like folded leaves, that's false hellebore. This one was flattened by the snowstorm we had 2 weeks ago, and you know, it looks just fine now. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6 or 7 of these individuals in and amongst the skunk cabbage, and it's a nice little herbaceous early ephemeral species in this landscape, and I just wanted to point that out. And we're here in a stand of plethora, so you can see some of the peppercorns, which is how I recognize these. This is an important wetland species. You can find it in many wetlands in this area, and this is a nice grove and stand of them. We've been that this last hike was several days after our last one, is I had been waiting for a month now to come to these 2 trees. I wanted you to be able to see them in full bloom, and this cool April that we've had, and it has been one of the coolest Aprils in ways since the 1870s, is that this has really stunted the flowering of this tree with the the many branches growing straight up off the trunk of this tree, leaning up over the river, over the Assabet River. And if we come down a little further, yeah, you can get closer to this one over here. There's a second one right here. And the flowers aren't fully out yet. And this is shadbush, serviceberry, shadblow is another name for it. Amelanchier is the scientific name. And this is another one where it's hard to speciate the amelanchiers. So this is most likely the more northern amelanchier, but it could be the Allegheny serviceberry, the more southern serviceberry. And this is a hard species to identify, except for one key trait once it gets to be a certain size, is there are very subtle stripes in this bark, extremely subtle. They're very nicely pronounced in this individual. And that's how I've learned to identify them. It probably took me about 5 or 10 years to really lock on to this pattern. This one's really nicely pronounced in its striping on the bark, but for a lot of individuals, especially when they're smaller, there's not much striping, and it's really hard to identify this species. It looks a lot like a musclewood, but it doesn't have that real strenuous structure in its trunk. And I wanted to show you the flowers. You can go downtown along the bike trail. The amelanchier that they planted there are in full bloom right now, and here they're still breaking bud. And I think the difference is that even though Maynard is a small town, there's an urban heat island effect, where downtown, because of all the built environment, is a good bit warmer than where we live on top of the hill behind this trail. But also down here at the bottom of the river, you get cold air drainage, so this will be a little cooler at night. And with the wet environment, the river and the wetlands, that keeps this area a little bit cooler too. So the combination of those things keeps these flowers probably 4 or 5 days behind schedule compared to amelanchier that are downtown by the mill pond that are in full bloom right now, or along the bike trail. And this is an important species for people that lived in this area for millennia. Well, I don't know what its original common name was, but one of them is shadbush, and that means that refers to the fish, the shad, that runs up river in early spring. And so when you're living in this landscape during these long cold winters and just trying to survive the winter, the shad run up river was an important source of protein. So for people that have lived here for thousands of years, when these trees started blooming, it meant the shad were running up river and it was time to have a feast. The other common name for this species is serviceberry, and that name comes from the time when you could bury your dead during the midst of a war, which is really not a nice thing to think about at this moment. But during the Revolutionary War, during the Civil War, when people died up north, especially servicemen, they couldn't be buried. They couldn't have a ceremony to bury them until the ground was thawed out, when it wasn't frozen, when it was easier to dig a grave. And so shadbush for the fish, serviceberry for the ceremony of burying servicemen, people that and women that fought in wars, who could not be buried until after the winter. This was the sign that spring was here and we could dig into the soil. So I wanted to see this on a glorious day, but go downtown now. The serviceberry are in full bloom. We're going to walk fairly quickly now to get to this one more stop before we get to the end of the trail. Actually, we're going to make one more stop. I wanted to stop on this tree because it doesn't look like anything like it should. I don't know what's causing this pattern in the bark, but this is an American beech tree, and I told you this is one of the smooth, just a simple gray bark, but this is really nicely striped. Maybe it's a type of lichen, maybe it's a type of trait characteristic to this individual, but when I first saw it a few weeks ago, I wasn't sure what it was, but then when I looked at the buds, and it has cigar-shaped pointy buds, very long cigar-shaped pointy buds, then I knew it was an American beech, and there's a couple leaves hanging on to the branch right now, so we could positively identify it that way. And you can see that on the ends of these twigs, you can see the long pointy buds. It's no other species in this part of the world looks like that, has buds like that. And here is a somewhat normal bark on a quickly, sadly, it's alive, it's not dying yet, but this is a little more what normal American beech looks like. American beech bark looks like. Alright, now we're going to go. We have a pignut hickory here, really rough bark. A nice steel gray color right there. Walking through a oak, hickory, upland type setting, very different from the wetland we were there. Most of these tree species are oak, black oak, which is something I want to talk to you about. And then there's some elms here. But I wanted to stop on this tree because on this side of it you'll see the beginnings of a pileated woodpecker doing some testing, I guess, some excavation testing of the bark. And we heard a pileated a couple weeks ago in this forest, and about a month ago I saw 3 of them on the same tree up trail further on a big wolf tree, having a conversation with each other. And so this is more evidence, and I've seen other drillings into trees like that are characteristic of pileated. They're rectangular, they're deep, and that's how you know pileated in an area. And pileated are the largest woodpeckers in North America, and they're also, for me, a personal reminder that we're in an old, mature forest. This isn't a terribly old forest, but it's becoming mature. There's a lot more deadwood on the ground. There are dying trees, and that's good habitat from my amateur experience for a pileated woodpecker. And so we'll get to the end of the trail in a second, and we'll summarize what we've learned and what we can infer from this. Come on,
I saw someone like
The red maple are starting to leaf out. It's spring. It's spring. Identify red maple this time of year is it produces its seeds in the spring and drops them. Unlike sugar maple, which produces its seeds, mature seeds at the end of the growing season and drops them in the fall, red maple does all its business now and it's a beautiful red, probably where the name red maple comes from. I want to stop with this tree right here. This is American elm. We've seen this one many times. It's an old favorite for a street tree, which is part of the reason the Maynard Tree Corps has become very active. We lost a lot of trees with the last drought downtown. They were mostly Norway maples. Norway maple and silver maple were common street trees that were planted to replace the American elm. The American elm was and can be again someday after the disease is conquered. Is a great street tree, and it was loved so much that it was planted all over the place, probably planted too much. And so when the Dutch elm disease came and knocked out the American elm, we lost a lot of street trees at once. And so I fall in love with this tree because of its bark color in the winter. I wanted to show you this flaring of the roots that makes it look almost tropical. That's one of the ways I identify this tree species. Red maple and a few others can do this, but I see this more often on elm trees, so it's one way I identify it. And so I'm glad we're stopping here with this American elm because we're going to finalize a species list that we would suggest could be planted in your yards, along your streets, in the town of Maynard and through this whole region, that'll be more resilient to future climate change, but more importantly, that's pretty important, but also that we're offering the list that'll help make our street trees more diverse. So when the next disease comes through, or when a heat wave comes through, or a severe drought and kills off many trees, if they're one species, we're going to lose a lot of trees at once. If there are multiple species, the theory or the hypothesis is that they'll be more resilient to whatever is coming down the road. So look for that. We're going to have a candidate tree list. We would love to put American elm back on this list, but there's not yet quite a reliable native strain on the list. And so there's my alarm. I'm going to wrap up now. So in a minute. So what we've seen, we've walked only about a mile. We've done 5 30-minute sessions. We've only walked a mile from Maynard off of Colbert up here into Acton, and along the trail, without trying very hard, we've seen 27 tree species. Shadbush was the 27th species, and that's a pretty high number. I was going to guess that it was in the lower 20s, but 27 is pretty good. I threw in some bushes, small trees, large bushes, whatever you want to call them, to put in this list, but 27 species. So that says a couple things. One, this is a very diverse forest, which bodes well for the future. And it's one that you should come visit because over the course of the year, greater diversity yields different kinds of aesthetics during different times of the season. Trees leaf at different times, they flower at different times, their leaf colors are different at different parts of the year. And so this rich forest is truly rich from a biological standpoint. You might wonder, why is this forest so rich? And I've come up with 3 ideas of why this is so rich. I don't know what the third one is. Maybe at least two. I had thought of three the other day. Let's see if the third one comes back. The first thing is this forest, being down near the river, is highly disturbed by people. And not just people the last couple hundred years, but it was probably managed in ways that I'm not positive about by people 5, 6, 7,000 years ago. There's an archaeological site, dig, that's been found where people used to gather here 7,000 years ago. More recently, we are standing where there used to be a mill that made gunpowder. Starting in 1835, this landscape was bought up and a gunpowder mill was put in, and this area was used as a gunpowder mill site for 105 years. Only as recently as 1940, so 1835 to 1940, this was an active industrial site making gunpowder. And the amazing thing, if you look this up, is there has been a series of explosions over that century that unfortunately killed about 30 people. But one was so loud that Thoreau over in Concord heard it and took a coach or something to come to see what happened. And he describes a pretty gruesome scene here. There was an explosion in 1895 where 3 buildings blew up, and things were found 500 yards away from where the buildings were. And so think about that, how intensely this landscape was used, how destructively it was blown up to atoms. In one of the articles I read, they said one of the men were blown to atoms probably. And yet when we come here in 2020, we have a rich forest. And this speaks to the resiliency of forests. That if we just give forests a chance and let them do their things, they can recover if the conditions are right. And so one thing we know about forest development over time is after a disturbance, many species come in, and actually tree diversity is often highest in the first part of a forest development. So one reason there are so many trees here, species I would say, is because this forest, especially down in this end, the trees are much smaller. This is a younger forest. And so we're still going through early forest development. In my mind, 80, 90, 100 years is not long for forest development. Come back to me when we're 500, 600 years down the road, and then we've got some really rich forest development. The other thing is, many of the species here that we've found are what I would call rich mesic species. So among those we saw black oak, we saw sugar maple, we see white ash, and then we saw spice bush. And there's another species that's slipping my mind right now, but when you start seeing those particular species in the same landscape, then you need to start, mocker nut hickory, my favorite one. Mocker nut hickory is the other one. When you see those species in the same setting, you got to think there's something different with the soils. That it's nutrient rich, there's a good amount of moisture, and so this is a fairly productive site. Being close to the river helps because of erosion over geologic time. The soils are a little finer here, and flooding from the river would deposit richer, finer soil.